Hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture on chapter 18. So this is our second to last lecture. I'm picking up from chapter 17. We're just gonna, as I said, carry on through the life cycle. So chapter 17 left off very early in the life cycle, just after the first year of life. So that's what we'll talk about here, that first year, well, I guess that second year, so from age 1 to age 2, we'll talk about toddlerhood, childhood, and adolescence, and that's where we'll pause at the end of chapter 18, and then next lecture, chapter 19, will be our last of this course, and we'll talk about kind of a review, actually, of most of what we've learned about so far, which is nutrition in adulthood, and then we'll add on to that with nutrition through the aging process. Okay, we'll go forward this way. Okay, so again, as we left off in chapter 17, we were talking about, the infant, the newborn, and that first year of life. So by the time the infant reaches age 1 year old or 12 months, we begin this stage of toddlerhood. So we use the term toddler to refer to anywhere between basically 1 year old to 3 years old. So right around that age, right around that 2-year-old mark. So what we see here is the rapid growth rate that was characteristic of infancy starts to slow down. So the growth rate slows down. Obviously, there's still a lot of growth occurring, but less rapidly, at a less rapid pace than we saw in infancy. On average, we would see growth, vertical growth, so growth in height of 5.5 to 7.5 inches over this 2-year period, and on average, a gain of 9 to 11 pounds over this 2-year period. Of course, we're going to see higher energy expended, so higher energy output, as the child grows and can become more mobile and moving around. And of course, that would be evident by increased physical activity levels. As you hopefully understand with energy balance, as the toddler begins to move around a lot more and is expending more energy, there's going to be an increased need in both macronutrients as well as micronutrients. And of course, as the body increases in height and weight, that of course also would indicate greater macro and micronutrient needs. So we'll revisit this term estimated energy requirement. I think that goes back to Unit 1. Well, we introduced it in Unit 1, but we really talked about it just last unit in Unit 4. So remember, this is the total amount of energy required in a given day, based on not just the body itself, but also the activity levels, as well as the type of food that a person is eating. So in adulthood, you might recall that we said EER is based on these 3 things: age, weight, physical activity level, but also sex and height. So this is an important thing to distinguish, is that at toddlerhood, the total energy requirement for the day is only based on age, weight, and physical activity. A couple other, actually this whole page is pretty important, so maybe I'll star that. Noticing that the recommendation for total fat is still above the AMDR that we see for adults. This is down from infancy. Remember, in infancy, it was actually 40 to 50% of total calories from fat. So it's starting to come down, but it's still not as low of a requirement as we see in adulthood. This is also a popular test question, so expect to see this on the final, and do make note what the AMDR for fat is for infancy and what the AMDR for fat is for toddlerhood. And note that those are different than the AMDR for fat for adulthood. Also, we're going to see a higher protein requirement. Remember that the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance for protein for an adult, is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. We did talk about slightly higher protein requirement for people who are athletes and engaging in pretty high amounts of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity weekly. So 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram body weight is higher than what we see the RDA is for general adult health. So that's important to note. Already right here, the RDA for carbohydrate is the RDA for carbohydrates for adults, right? 130 grams per day. As always, whenever there's a conversation about carbohydrates, they should always be complex carbohydrates as much as is possible. We see even a moderate fiber intake here at 14 grams per day. 14 grams per 1,000 kilograms per day. So again, depending on the toddler's overall caloric requirement for the day, this might be the total fiber requirement for the day. So that's important to note. We're going to talk about reasons for why that is. I mean, the simplest explanation is that still, at 1 year of age, into the 3rd year of age, this person's digestive system is still very young and very much developing. So having such a high fiber intake as we would see in adulthood is really not necessary, and this is potentially counterproductive, actually. So fiber, of course, is still important, but it's not as high as we would see in adulthood, and that also goes along with there's not as many calories coming into the body, so there would be a lower total amount of fiber. With micronutrients, so again, as always, ensure adequate intake of all micronutrients. Best to obtain them from fruits and vegetables, as we saw a lot of our, not all, but the vast majority of our micronutrients come from fruits and vegetables. Certainly pay special attention to some of the ones that we've already mentioned during pregnancy and breastfeeding and infancy. Of course, now calcium and potassium start to play a larger role. Vitamin E, we see this for the first time becoming a really important nutrient to pay attention to. And then, of course, iron and zinc are really critical for that growth and development. Again, vitamin D supplementation may be recommended. The same references would apply, right? Anybody who's living at, any children who are growing up in far north latitudes, above 40 degrees north latitude, so that's all of us here in New York State, and even Pennsylvania. I guess I'd have to look at a map to remember exactly where 40 degrees goes across, but I think it's all of Pennsylvania, if not most of it. But also, I mean, anybody living in a southern hemisphere at south of 40 degrees south latitude, remember skin pigmentation, so darker skin is going to inhibit more vitamin D UV absorption from the sun. And then, of course, winter months, we're not making as much vitamin D because of the reduced sunlight. So supplementation may be worth considering depending on the circumstances. And this is an interesting note for anyone who is going to give their child cow's milk, because the AMDR for fat is higher during toddlerhood. It is actually suggested to consume whole milk, at least during that first phase of toddlerhood. Yeah, but as I've discussed with some of you offline, drinking cow's milk is not a necessary part of a toddler's diet. Yes, it can be a good source of calcium, but we also learned that there are many other healthy sources of calcium too. And then iron deficiency anemia is definitely possible here. So again, make sure to get enough iron. And this iron is the most common nutrient deficiency in young children. Fluid intake for toddlers. So this is really important because, again, this is the time in their life where they're weaning from breast milk and moving into whole food, or solid foods consumption. So there's, they're going from a totally liquid diet, which is breast milk, to now starting to eat solid food. So this is a really important reminder to make sure that actual fluid gets into their diet now too, as they wean off the breast milk. The more active they are, the more fluids they would need. The RDA is a minimum of 1.3 liters per day. Some of that can come from like fresh fruits and vegetables and other foods, like if they are, if you make a puree and you put quite a bit of liquid in it, that can actually contribute to some of their fluid intake for the day. This is just a helpful kind of FYI and reference chart. I don't think there's anything on here that I need you to know or remember, but of course, take this as you will if you're interested. But I'll point out some trends. So what I do want, I guess the one thing I do want you to take away with this, from this, is the trends in, especially the micronutrients. Oops, that didn't highlight. Especially the micronutrients. You'll see they all increase as age increases, all the way up to adolescence, right? So vitamin A, the need increases. Vitamin C, the need increases as the body gets larger. Vitamin E increases. Calcium increases. Iron increases. Zinc definitely increases. And fluids increase as well. What's interesting is that the fat, I don't know why they don't show this, but the fat actually decreases, as we've been talking about. The protein also decreases, and the carbohydrate stays the same. So that, I think, is a really, I guess, maybe there is more to this chart than I realized. That, I think, is a really important thing to note. Basically, what this is saying, and I wish they would include a fourth column, which is adulthood, but these are practically the recommendations for adulthood that you see written here in the adolescence column. But what this is saying is, right, during childhood and during adolescence, we have a decreasing, basically, caloric need. It obviously increases in total calories to a point, but then it actually plateaus. And as we'll see when we talk about adulthood, ultimately the total calorie requirement starts to go down. So anyhow, that's an important piece, just again, kind of as an FYI. That won't necessarily show up on a test. But for our purposes, I think really recognizing that these micronutrient daily requirements increase through childhood and through adolescence, which hopefully is intuitive, right? As the body is literally growing in size, and probably the person is becoming more physically active throughout those childhood and adolescent years. I mean, if I haven't said it enough, always important to make nutritious food choices. So we're still in toddlerhood here. I think it's really interesting. A really interesting concept of a healthy practice is actually to let the toddlers kind of explore their own food choice and their own rates of eating. Obviously, healthy food should be available, and a variety of healthy food should be available. So from healthy choices, let the toddler select what they want to eat. I think that is a really interesting practice. They're often able to, as the first bullet indicates, a toddler is often pretty able to, when given the right choices to choose from, able to choose correctly what they need to eat. Also, I think a really important practice is to not force food on children. This is a really sensitive, toddlerhood and childhood and even adolescence is a really sensitive time for cultivating food behaviors that are going to carry with this person into their adult years. So, the food environment should be as stress-free and simple as possible. I realize, in modern working worlds, and some people are working and in school and with children, often single parenting, I know it's not easy to make the food environment simple and easy, but as much as it can be, it should be a pleasant environment, without too much stress, so that kids can hopefully develop healthy food behaviors right from go. Remember that again, we're still here in the toddler years, 1 to 3 years old. So small meals is probably a better option because it's still a small body. And again, let the toddler be involved in their establishment of food practices, again, within the context of healthy options. But it's probably a good thing if they want to have, basically 6 small meals throughout the day instead of 3 meals like an adult might have. Of course, as we talked about a little bit in chapter 17, make sure to kind of slowly progress the complexity of the food. Certainly in that in that second year of life, from 1-year-old to 2-year-old, still mostly giving one type of food at a time, especially as you're starting to introduce solid food. And don't do too much mixing of flavors in the beginning. Slowly get into that as the years progress. Again, small portions, and of course, role modeling is super important. So again, whatever the parent is doing, or the guardians, the primary caretakers, kids are very observant, and they're going to want to do what their role model is doing, not what the role model is saying. So that's really powerful, I think, too, is to provide healthy options to the child, provide those same healthy options to yourself, and make healthy choices from a variety of healthy options. Just a simple visual here, I guess, that the portion sizes are going to be quite small, right? This is still a very small child. Again, introduce new foods gradually, as we just said, one at a time. This way you can still monitor for allergic reactions. And again, the most common food allergens: wheat, peanuts, cow's milk, soy, citrus fruits, egg whites, and seafood. A couple notes on vegetarian families. So vegetarian would still include eggs and dairy. Vegan diet would exclude all products coming from animals. So all meat, all eggs, all dairy products, anything that even might have milk or cheese or something or eggs in it. Your book says, it might be low on protein, might be low on certain minerals, and might be low on D and B12. I think as with any case, any diet can be low in protein, minerals, or vitamins D and B12. So as with any diet, it's important to, again, make sure that the options that are being offered to the child are sound and healthful, and making sure that they are actually meeting adequate intakes for protein, calcium, iron, zinc, and D and B12. Again, there's a variety of reasons why somebody, why a person or a child would need to supplement with especially D and B12, and even possibly zinc. And that goes beyond vegetarian and vegan diets. So everybody should pay attention to those. Again, that note on fiber. So of course you're going to be introducing fiber as you're introducing solid foods. But remember, the fiber requirement is not quite as high as it would be in adulthood. And part of that is just because it's a smaller stomach. And so we don't want to have, and calorie intake is really quite critical at this stage in life, so as to not become malnourished or undernourished. And fiber is one of the things that contributes to that sense of fullness, you might recall. That goes back to Unit 1. So still include fiber in the meals, but just be conscientious that it's not, every single component of the meal is the most high fiber food possible. And then, of course, consider using foods that are fortified, especially with some of these micronutrients up here. And consider supplement use, but again, always the best way is to get these nutrients from the food itself. Another consideration is lead toxicity. We visited that briefly in chapter 17. So toddlers who are more at risk for lead exposure, any facility, like any home or apartment that is either much older and still has lead pipes, or lead paint, or something that's maybe poorly maintained. Oftentimes, unfortunately, we see this in the United States for families or children who are recently immigrated to the United States. Also, again, unfortunately, we often see this more likely in racial and ethnic minorities, low-income households, and potentially also at work, where a family member might be exposed to lead and then kind of brings traces of it into the house. So lead toxicity can cause developmental delays, that's cognitive in particular. So that can lead to long-term cognitive issues. There's a higher risk for substance abuse and other health issues, and oftentimes a lower IQ for anyone who has experienced the lead toxicity. There are some nutritional things we can do to kind of work against the toxic effects of lead. So vitamin C, again, you'll notice these are the same nutrients that appeared on the previous page, well, except for vitamin C, but vitamin C, calcium, iron, and zinc can all work to lower the risk of lead poisoning. Alrighty, so moving into the preschool years. So this is kind of like from the end of toddlerhood, so roughly 3 years old through 8 years old. 8, 9, or 10, I guess, depending on how you cut it. So in this stage, again, still growing, but the rate of growth slows down. So we're going to see an average height gain of 2 to 4 inches per year. And that may come in spurts, right? It's not all, it's not like a perfect progression. Definitely important to maintain physical activity. And still here in this early childhood age, well, in this childhood age range, the estimated energy requirement is still only based on these 3 things: age, weight, and total amount of physical activity. And again, so much of that is because the height of the children is going to vary just depending on their growth trajectory. So that's why we don't consider height in EER for children just yet. So as we saw on that chart a few slides back, all RDAs, the RDAs for just about every nutrient increases. And it is towards the end of childhood, as a person enters into adolescence, that sexual maturation begins. And it's at this point that we start to see differing DRI values for males and females, because there's very different growth trajectories after puberty, after sexual maturation. So macronutrient needs during childhood, so total fat intake should gradually drop. The recommendation for childhood is pretty close to what we see for adults, just a tad bit higher. Again, total carbohydrate is what we see for adults. Fiber intake is still going to be in that 14 grams per 1,000 calories, and total protein is still a tiny bit higher than for adult years, but again, declining from toddlerhood. Micronutrients is the same deal. Still get adequate intake of fruits and vegetables. The same nutrients are of concern. Calcium is not listed here, but that would definitely still be one. And of course, fiber is important. You'll notice potassium. I think magnesium would be another good one to put on here. Right? These are all nutrients that are involved in growth, involved in immune health, involved in new tissue development, involved in gut health, involved in fluid balance. So yeah, important to pay attention to all of those. And then fluoride is also important here too, especially for the developing teeth. Most municipalities have added fluoride to the water supply. Otherwise, you can certainly get fluoride treatment at the dentist's office. Of course, fluid needs are increasing here, so the RDA for children is about 5 to 8 cups per day of water. Of course, activity level and climate are going to further affect that. I think this is a really important note. Caffeine and added sugar beverages should still not be, it really should not be introduced even in the childhood years. Again, these are still very formative years in terms of taste preference and food, food behaviors. Caffeine, again, is an appetite suppressant, so that can really throw off the child's natural development of, again, eating patterns, so as to be getting adequate caloric intake on a daily basis. It's really common, in my practice anyway, to see, people who've been taking caffeine since childhood or late childhood, early adolescence, and really don't have healthy eating patterns, whatsoever. Maybe when they get around to eating, the food is healthy, but oftentimes people might be eating 1 time per day, and it's actually a relatively small meal. And then added sugars, again, too, can contribute to literally a form of psychological addiction to sugar. So really important to limit as much as possible, or even just straight up avoid exposure to added sugar beverages and caffeinated beverages during childhood. As always, you can follow the USDA My Plate, the daily food plan, the dietary guidelines for assistance in meeting the nutrient requirements. This is figure 18.3. I think kind of a maybe fun, helpful visual for getting all the different food groups. Again, my advice is that dairy is not a recommended, not a necessary food group. If you go back to Unit 1, we compared the US Dietary Guidelines for Americans to the Harvard School of Public Health and their recommendations for a healthy diet. You might recall the major difference was that the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate doesn't have a dairy group. Dairy can be part of a healthy diet, but it is not a necessary part of a healthy diet. And in fact, again, my recommendation, and that coming out of the Harvard School of Public Health, is if dairy is included, it should be limited to 1 to 2 servings per day. So you can see as the, it's not going to show, but up here at the top, you can see as the age range increases, again, the total amounts of each of these food groups is going to increase, which goes along with the increasing EER, increasing body size, and hopefully increasing physical activity. And then you can see examples of what is a cup or a cup equivalent or an ounce equivalent, and some mostly healthy options. Nutrition-related concerns during childhood, again, making sure that the kids are choosing nutritious foods, that they have access to nutritious food choices. Again, iron deficiency anemia is still a leading cause of a leading nutrient deficiency in childhood. And then we'll also revisit these concepts of food insecurity and hunger. So any of these things can affect, again, the nutrient status of the body, the nourishment of the body, whether it's malnourished or undernourished or overnourished. So nutritious food choices. During childhood, we start to see the influences of peer pressure. And so, depending on the nature of their peers, kids may be more inclined or interested in making unhealthy food choices. This is why it's so important, I think, at the family level as much as possible to really encourage healthful eating choices and healthy food options. Body image starts to play in here. So remember, we talked about this, I guess, back in chapter 13 and 14. So again, really critical at this stage in their life to support healthy eating habits and support a healthy, support a child in cultivating a healthy relationship with food. Families who plan, prepare, and eat meals together are more successful at promoting good food choices. There's been a lot of research over the years, which I find fascinating, just looking at how families do food together. And interestingly, but probably not surprisingly, when there's distraction during a family dinner, or if that's sort of the natural setting for a family dinner, we find that families who maybe do eat meals together, but they're not necessarily like sitting around a table eating a meal. They may be watching TV or kind of eating disjointedly. It's not always the case, but there is a higher association that when family meals are done in this way, there's higher intake of fried foods, sweets, snacky foods, added sugar beverages, fast foods, and lower intakes of fruits and vegetables. So again, I think it's really interesting just to pay attention to not only the what in terms of food and nutrition, but the how. How are we doing these things? How are we engaging with food? How are we eating? Because the how so often influences the what. Eat together, eat better. Iron deficiency anemia, another concern. So some risk factors. We see that iron deficiency anemia seems to be higher among Mexican American children and, again, low-income families. That may have to do with food insecurity, lack of access to healthful choices, potentially lack of information about how to put together healthful meals. Also potentially, again, food insecurity, potentially parents are working so much just to make ends meet, and maybe don't have as much access to healthful food options. We also see risk for iron deficiency anemia in children who have poor appetites or erratic eating behaviors. So again, ideally, hopefully some of this can be corrected through healthy family habits and healthy family behaviors with food. But iron supplementation is always an option if needed, because of course iron deficiency anemia is not something that we want to let develop. So iron deficiency anemia is associated with behavioral, cognitive delays, I guess we could say, but issues as well as motor delays and impaired immune system. And then food insecurity and hunger. So again, something we just talked about in Unit 4. 17% of American households with children and adolescents are experiencing food hunger and insecurity. It's a pretty high percentage. What we find is that breakfast, especially with the way the school system is set up, right? Breakfast is really critical for kids because, we expect them to go into a classroom and just oftentimes sit there or maybe engage in some activities, but the school environment is not ideal for every single child, and in order to do what's expected of them in the classroom, any person needs some calories in their body, including healthy carbohydrates to get some glucose for the brain. And so if that hasn't been provided in a breakfast meal, it becomes really difficult for a child to actually concentrate and pay attention in the classroom. Because they're hungry and their brains are quite literally hungry for energy. So of course that can play into behavioral problems, that can play into poor success rates in the classroom. It can also certainly interfere with the child's immune system, and also their psychosocial health might be affected. So we'll talk about a few government and private programs that can support and play a role here. We've touched on a few before, but we will revisit a couple in this lecture. So you might remember the National School Lunch and the National School Breakfast programs. The NSLB, so National School Lunch and Breakfast Program. We talked really briefly about this in Unit 4 as well, but it's a program of the federal government that supplies the funding to provide food to children who are unable to get breakfast at home for whatever reason, based on income level. So a school breakfast hopefully would be a nutritious breakfast that would help to optimize nutrition intake and avoid, the behavioral and learning problems that might arise from hunger. Unfortunately, there isn't really monitoring, right? Like the child may go and get the breakfast, but there's no monitoring to see that they've actually eaten it. Oftentimes also cafeterias are selling soft drinks that are laden with added sugars and other snack foods. Same case in the school lunch programs. There's no monitoring to see that the kids are actually eating the healthy meal. And oftentimes there are various options, some of which are healthy, many of which are not. And so even if the student is on the National School Lunch Program, and receiving lunch at the school, it's not guaranteed to be a healthy meal. So one suggestion we could make there, or one improvement that could be made, is kind of setting up the cafeteria in such a way so as to really encourage the children to select the healthful options, or even removing the unhealthy options so that the only option is healthy. So it's a good starting place, I think, for sure, to be assisting all these children and families by providing these meals at the school. But certainly there's plenty of room for continual improvement. And then on to adolescence, so the last age group that we'll talk about for this chapter. So adolescence begins kind of in that 8, 9, or 10-year-old range and continues through 18 years. At the onset of adolescence, we see puberty, or the development of secondary sex characteristics, which means the male or female is now capable of reproduction. So during this developmental phase, kids may be less responsive to parental guidance, and most adolescents navigate the challenges into mature and healthy adults. Yeah. Woohoo. Adolescence, so the growth spurt begins at around age 10 to 11 years old for females and a little bit later for males. Growth spurts lead to an average of 20 to 25% increase in height. I think we can all kind of reflect back on that and remember, that point in adolescence where that point in childhood, I guess, where everybody suddenly starts to grow pretty tall. Or maybe you've seen that with your children or, younger siblings if you have them, or older siblings. So average females reach almost full height by the onset of menstruation or menarche. And that varies depending on the person, what age menstruation begins. Males, on the other hand, often continue to grow into early adulthood. I don't actually remember which lecture it was in, maybe the bones lecture, when we talked about bone health, but oftentimes females have actually reached full height by about 17 or 18 years old, whereas males might still be growing into their early 20s. You don't really need, I don't think you need to know this for my class, but just kind of an interesting thing. There's what are called the epiphyseal plates at the ends of long bones. And it's quite literally when these plates close that growth in terms of height, so skeletal growth in terms of increasing length of the long bones, finishes. Certainly during adolescence, we're going to see some significant changes to total weight as well as body composition, which will largely be influenced by lifestyle, so physical activity, nutrition, hydration, use or lack thereof of drugs, etc. So here is the epiphyseal plate, which is at the end of each long bone. And so it's quite literally just a section where, this is actually the section where the bones grow in length, so where new bone is formed. And so when this plate, let me actually erase my highlighter so you can see it. When that plate actually closes and these two sections of bone actually fuse with each other, that's when growth stops. Nutrition needs for adolescents. So it's now that EER is based on sex, age, physical activity level, weight, and height. So remember, that's true for adults, and so those changes begin here in adolescence. And again, hopefully that starts to make sense. We just saw a few slides back that it's with the onset of secondary sex characteristics and sexual maturation that the dietary reference intake values for males and females begin to change, because males develop in very different ways than females at that point. And then also we see that height becomes terminal here in adolescence. So now height can become a factor for EER. Again, with the macronutrient recommendations in adolescence, everything is still just a touch higher than it is for adulthood. So still slightly higher recommendation for fat, just a touch higher recommendation for protein. Carbohydrate is still right in that same zone that is the AMDR for adulthood. And still, the recommendation to not have more than 10% of total energy from saturated fat. And here's where we see the fiber requirement now meeting that requirement that we see in adulthood. Micronutrient needs, so definitely an important time for calcium. This is when calcium requirement is at its greatest, because we do see those growth spurts very characteristic of adolescence. Iron needs also increase quite a bit. Sorry, I missed the boys and girls here. So iron needs are always slightly lower for males than they are for females, and again, that's because of menarche at this point. So again, this is one example of how the DRIs change for males versus females at the onset of puberty. So because of the menstrual cycle monthly, females are going to see much greater rate of iron turnover, and so they have a higher need for iron intake. Vitamin A is, of course, critical. Not only does it help with vision, but it supports growth and development throughout the body. And always, a balanced, healthful diet is what we're looking for. Supplements are, again, exactly as the name implies. They're something that is supplemental to an already helpful diet. They should not take the place of a healthy diet. So again, the recommendation is not to go out and eat burgers and Whoppers and Big Macs and whatnot, and then come home and take a multivitamin. The recommendation is to select healthful foods. And if there is a nutrient deficiency, despite having a very healthy diet, then take a supplement. Fluid recommendations. So again, activity level is going to be a major factor for the actual fluid recommendation per person. But we see for males, it's up to 11 cups a day, and females at least 8 cups a day. And then this increases further into adulthood. Obviously, remember the conversations we had about heat syncope and heat stroke. So any adolescent who is exercising in the heat definitely has a higher fluid need. Parents are still going to be role models, whether they think they are or not, in adolescent years. Certainly, we see very strong influence of peers during this time. Also, we begin to see influence from mass media, as well as personal preferences starting to develop. So, as always, encourage healthy base to your diet, to an adolescent's diet. Nutrition-related concerns. So, calcium is the big one because of the major bone growth that we see in this time of life. Also, this is the time to look out for disordered eating patterns and disordered eating behaviors. Again, some of this might have already been influenced in childhood, but because of the kind of development, as an individual during adolescent years, this is where we really start to see the behaviors or the disordered behavior showing. Acne is also possible at this time in life. So typically we see that there are some foods that really seem to be triggers for acne for most people, although again, the individual cause can vary depending on the person, but high glycemic index foods. So what that means is high sugar foods, and typically really processed foods. So foods maybe that have a lot of chemical additives, foods maybe that are high in saturated fat, foods that are low in fiber, or foods that are high in salt. So worse yet is, that combination of both things. So heavily processed foods that are high in saturated fat and high in added sugars. Those seem to be the trigger for acne for a lot of people. Ways to reduce acne, just follow a healthy diet. We talked briefly about the Mediterranean diet back in Unit 1, but again, everything we've been saying so far, get a mix, get your micronutrients. There are certain ones that do promote skin health in particular. Vitamin C and vitamin E come to mind, but it's not only, the way to reduce acne isn't only through eating healthy foods, it's also through removing unhealthy foods that are going to cause acne in the first place. Also in adolescence, we see, experimentation with cigarettes, this day and age, e-cigarettes, alcohol, and other illegal drugs. And so again, for parents or for caretakers or guardians, recognizing that all of these behaviors can influence nutrition and healthful food choice. And then I think this is really kind of working towards the end of the lecture here, just a few words on pediatric obesity. We obviously spent like a whole lecture talking about obesity in adulthood and healthy body weight. So we'll reflect a little bit on it here in childhood. So the BMI scales during childhood are a bit different than what we see for adulthood. But basically what we're looking for to designate overweight is having a BMI that's above the 85th percentile of other kids in the same age and same sex. And then for obesity in childhood, again, that's indicated by a BMI that's above the 95th percentile for other children of the same age and sex. And then you can further classify class 2 and class 3 obesity. Yeah, the risks of pediatric obesity are a little different than what we see in adulthood. Obviously, the same issues would apply. You know, somebody who is obese is at greater risk for developing chronic disease. The difference is that in pediatric obesity, I suppose it's considered that there's more time to turn it around, especially while the body is still developing and is you know, a little bit more robust, I guess, than in adulthood. So yeah, we'll come back to that concept in just a second. So some of the risks for pediatric obesity, so it can exacerbate asthmatic symptoms, it can impair a child's sleep or lead to sleep apnea, certainly impairs the child's mobility and ability to get around, and it can be a source of, you know, I guess, unfortunate social issues. So could potentially lead to teasing, it could lead to a sense or development of low self-esteem, and even some social isolating to avoid being teased. Of course, there's a greater risk for, again, developing type 2 diabetes, having high blood cholesterol levels, having high blood pressure, developing gallstones, developing depression, and other medical problems. Certainly, someone who's obese in childhood is at a much greater risk for being overweight in adulthood or obese in adulthood. And so pediatric obesity can certainly be reversed. This says through an aggressive, comprehensive nationwide health campaign. Certainly that's true. I mean, I think the system is, you know, as much responsible as the individual for everyone's health. But there's certainly a lot that an individual can do or that a family can do to reverse pediatric obesity so that, you know, this person can enter their adult years at a healthy weight. We see there's an early tendency during toddler years, you know, feeding issues, behavioral issues, whatever, you know, access to healthful foods. Depending on the family life, like it can be pretty tricky to get off to a good start in the toddler years. So certainly it's an important time to monitor for weight in those toddler years. Definitely important to encourage physical activity. As I've said over and over again, right? Focus on nutrient-dense foods, limit exposure to junk foods and empty calorie foods. Don't even offer things that have, you know, added sugar beverages or high added sugar foods. Certainly early intervention with pediatric obesity is the best way to address it. And again, that is true of adulthood obesity too. So what can the family do? Again, provide nutritious choices, encourage a healthful breakfast, encourage healthy eating patterns and eating behaviors. Remember that, you know, especially parents, but siblings as well, can be role models. And so, you know, encourage healthy food behaviors for all members of the family, not just the child. As we saw, sitting down and eating meals together, undistracted by TV or computers or tablets or phones, right? Sit down, talk to each other, literally eat the food together. No TV at meal times. I love this concept of encouraging attentive eating and encouraging enjoyment of the food. So again, really encouraging a healthy relationship with food right from the get-go. I always think this is an important one to reflect on too. I realize this can be hard to feel like this is true in the moment, but, you know, especially for kids, you know, before the age of 10 and really before the age of 18, you know, parents are the ones with the food, with the monetary power here. So parents are really the ones who purchase the food, have the financial capacity to purchase the food. So really parents should be the one in control of, you know, the quality of the food that comes into the house. Yeah. So I think that's an important one to keep in mind, no matter how much your kids want to convince you otherwise. And then what role can the school play? So again, revisiting the national school lunch and breakfast programs. Ideally, these should be low in fat. They should really not have any added sugar, and they should be, moderate in sodium. Foods could also take a good look at what other food options are, schools should also take a good look at what other options they're selling to kids with regard to foods and beverages, because many of them have soda dispensing machines, candy dispensing machines, ice cream dispensing machines. In my opinion, none of that should be in a school. Those are treats, not daily foods that anybody should be consuming. Policies limiting competitive foods reduce the risk of overweight and obesity. Yeah, again, not just having it be the school's choice, but also having laws and policies limiting what types of junk foods can be sold in schools. That could be an option going forward. And there should also be good messaging so that it's not just, here are healthy foods that you can have, but then, in the classroom, we're going to watch this program and there's going to be a commercial for Coke or a commercial for some current favorite junk food, right? There should be hopefully a consistent message throughout the school, from all educators, from all teachers, from all staff at the school to promote healthy food choices. We also talked a little bit about garden-based learning in Unit 4. This can be another way to encourage interest in healthy eating. So especially from a young age, but really all the way up through high school, getting kids involved in growing their food from the very beginning, right? Seeing that food comes from just about everything we eat comes from a seed, and the seed grows into a plant and then may bear fruit, or we eat different parts of the plant and call it a vegetable, or we eat different fruits and call it a bean or a legume or a nut or a seed. So there really is the vast majority of our food is plant-based, especially in a healthful diet. So I'm a big proponent of garden-based learning. I think it does wonders not only to educate people about their food, but it also gives a reason to be interested in healthy eating beyond just the health benefits of the food. So kind of makes it a little more wholesome, I guess, and for a lot of people, a little more interesting. And then physical activity. So, for children and adolescents, it's recommended that aerobic physical activity they engage in aerobic physical activity for at least an hour a day. Bone and muscle strengthening activities should be performed at least 3 days a week. So again, these are things that hopefully a school can provide. And certainly, as I think we see with a lot of well-structured physical education classes or gym classes, encouraging non-competitive, fun and structured activities. Also, activities that allow for self-pacing can encourage all children to get involved in physical activity, and finding different types of physical activities so that each person can kind of develop their interest in a specific physical activity, because there's so many different things that can be done, and we don't all have to like the same thing. Here are some cool examples. I think this is a 2-page chart, so different types of physical activities for children and for adolescents. So you'll see there's 2 different columns. But again, lots of different fun stuff. These are all moderate intensity. You see riding a bike, walking, skateboarding, hiking, rollerblading. Maybe as the kids grow up, engaging in some housework or yard work. Maybe doing some racket sports or baseball or softball. I thought I saw horseback riding. Vigorous intensity aerobic activities. So things like jumping rope, potentially also martial arts, a lot of team field sports, cross-country skiing, games that involve running or chasing. And then you'll see a lot of the same things for adolescents. Maybe dancing could be added in there. Muscle strengthening activities. So what can be done for muscle strengthening? Rope or tree climbing, a lot of resistance activities that just use body weight. push-ups, sit-ups, swinging, using the monkey bars. For adolescents, this could look like maybe engaging then with actual weight machines or free weights or resistance machines, weight machines. Rock climbing, against, and then a lot of the same ones that can be done with body weight. And then what can be done for bone strengthening? So again, this is one where the bones have to resist against a weight. So you'll see a lot of similar things in here for bone strengthening. Running, I think, is a classic one. Again, jumping rope, basketball, volleyball, tennis, gymnastics. You'll see the same ones for adolescents. I guess I'll just make this note down here. I think this is kind of obvious, but some activities can be moderate or vigorous depending on how much effort you put into it. So running, for example, biking, for example, walking, for example, could be anywhere from low to moderate to vigorous intensity. Again, parents and other adults can act as role models, so not just telling kids to engage in physical activity, but actually engaging in physical activity themselves. Doing shared activities, so that, again, maybe doing activities together as a family. That's a great way for everybody to be active, but also to share some quality time together. Could be, little games in the yard with a ball, or if you've got bikes, going on bike rides together. I think really critical to support healthy physical activity is to limit the amount of time spent with, well, I would say screens, but these days everything is done with a screen. So outside of school or outside of work, I guess for kids we're talking about outside of school, limiting additional TV time or electronic game time to not more than 2 hours a day. And I think what's really interesting is if we go back here, the recommendation for physical activity is 1 hour a day. And this is allowing up to 2 hours a day for electronic games or TV. In my opinion, maybe those two should be reversed. Interestingly, again, in modern times, we now have a lot of different electronic games that can be physically active. So probably too many to name here, and I probably only know the names of a few, but this can also be a way to, if a kid really wants to be playing video games, maybe encourage them to play some of these actual physically active video games. There's this notion, as I roughly mentioned before, that overweight or obese children can technically catch up to their weight as they grow taller, and that can be done without restricting food intake and therefore without restricting nutrient intake. I think that's, that can go either way, right? That can work out well, or that can kind of lead to further weight gain. So again, each situation, each person is unique in terms of how that would be addressed. Again, with physical activity, hopefully we're establishing motor skills as well as muscle strength, as well as cardiovascular health. We know that physical activity can help with healthy sleep patterns. Again, it can develop a good positive self-esteem. It can lower stress. Of course, it's critical for developing that peak bone density. And again, it supports healthy cardiovascular and respiratory health. Physically fit children have improved behavior, are more attentive in the classroom, are more focused, and have higher levels of academic achievement. So again, parents, healthcare providers, community members, school teachers, school staff, after-school providers, all of these individuals, again, the community at large, can all play a pretty important role in promoting not only healthy physical activity and engaging in physical activity, but also healthy food patterns too. So, it does take a village to raise a child. And then lastly, ways that we would treat pediatric obesity. So always the first step would be lifestyle modifications. So improving dietary intake while decreasing total caloric intake and increasing physical activity. So anything that we've ever mentioned before around improving diet, right? Eating more complex carbohydrate foods, eating more fruits and vegetables, drinking enough water, getting healthy sources of protein, and reducing saturated fat intake, reducing intake of junk food, basically reducing intake of highly processed foods, reducing intake of excessive added sugar, excessive sodium, excessive fat. As needed, certainly consult with a registered dietitian or nutritionist. Yeah, depending on the case, that can be really helpful. There could be weekly visits, bi-weekly visits, monthly visits. Again, depending on the needs, maybe we would consult a behavior health expert, an exercise specialist, and always, the primary care provider. Okay, so that is it for chapter 18. Not a super lengthy chapter. I think there's a little bit more in the book maybe that we didn't cover, especially around some of those, the school policies and what the schools can do to promote healthy behaviors and healthy food choices and physical activity. So definitely read this chapter in your book if you're interested, especially as this was a relatively short lecture. Yeah, but as always, I'll thumb through these questions for your review. Email me with any questions. Thanks for listening.